Betty, we're now getting into the late 1960s and the early 1970s, and I know that you were introduced to an organization which ultimately was going to play a big role in your life, and you were going to play a big role in its life. That's the Anglican Fellowship of Prayer. So can you tell me a little bit about the early days of the AFP?
I think a little bit.
Yeah.
Helen Shoemaker was the go-getter, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. She had a very quiet person, prayed differently to Helen, but they were made a great team, Polly Wiley. And initially, because of Helen's husband being the rector, downtown Pittsburgh, he began to be getting these men who were being laid off from the steel mills, and they would be executive types, and they were devastated by having lost their positions. And he began to get so many of them, he began to put them in twos to pray for each other for a month. Well, the wives began to see changes in their husbands, and they too got interested in this phenomena that was happening in the face of all this difficulty. So, bit by bit, somehow or another, these prayer groups were put together by Helen Shoemaker and Polly and some others to start and have a conference. And it was called the Prayer Group Conference or something to that effect. And I heard and saw pictures of 1,000 being at these things. So I imagine that might have had something to do with Helen's push to get 5 people together to unite the Anglican Church. So she got Bishop Bardsley in England, Bishop Allen in the United States, Bishop Wilkinson in Toronto, and herself and Polly. The 5 of them formed together and formed the Anglican Fellowship of Prayer in the first place. And then from that, a man named Jack Clough, a reverend from our Diocese of Toronto and West, got interested, and there was a skeleton group of people put together to see what they could do by areas here. My husband was one of them for this area, the Toronto area probably, and he went to 1 or 2 meetings. I don't recall that there was a lot went on, but a few things I just heard, and including going to an international meeting, which the year I heard of was Albany. To go to Albany, Sister Evangeline from the convent, and Tom and I.
The Sisters of
St. John the Divine.
Yes, okay. Yes.
A wiry little sister, and very fascinated by the life of prayer. Well, I went too, and we all went off to Albany, and all the way down, all I could think of was ways that this thing could work, how this could work, and we ought to do this and that and the other thing, and I would keep talking to Sister, and she would say, you ought to do something like this. And my husband was getting called off in other directions on committees and things. So it sort of all worked out that I did land a job of,
Yeah.
And I think by that time too I was on we had the Toronto Prayer Committee, though not part of the Anglican Fellowship of Prayer at that point. So, and from there I got asked to go to Florida to, I guess I must have been the chair of the Toronto Committee at one point, and I got asked then, because of that, to go to Florida to their international meeting.
This begins to sound almost explosive. You know,
Yes.
but I mean, you start from nothing. You
Yes.
start from people who have a need
Yes.
in a city which is suffering economic difficulties,
Yes.
to an idea for putting people together, to suddenly something which becomes a conference of 1,000, to something which gets formed as the Anglican Fellowship of Prayer. Now the question is, and I think you've answered it, how does it get formed in such a way that it enters Canada? And who is there at the outset? So thank you for that, Betty.
Okay.